Our next speaker is going to be Sahar Aziz, which is the principal of the Law Office of Sahar Aziz Practice. Ms. Aziz practice focuses on immigration, employment, and civil rights. Ms. Aziz also advises nonprofit organizations in developing effective strategies and programs to achieve their institutional objectives. She's going to be leading a workshop, a legal workshop, about knowing your rights. So please also give her a warm welcome.
Assalamu alaikum. Hi, my name is Sahar Aziz, and I wanted to thank you all for inviting me today. I want to thank in particular Saadiyya, Aden, and Abukar Arman for their tireless efforts. I was privileged to be here last year, and I'm really thrilled to see that it's happening again, and inshallah it will happen every year in the foreseeable future. So this is very good work that's being done and very needed. Okay, so I titled this Path to Civic Engagement because I do think that knowing your rights is a key part of civic engagement. That is a big cliche that's used particularly when it comes to Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians and Somalis from the government when they're telling our communities to integrate and engage. So part of that is to know your rights. And just the usual disclaimers, which is the information in this presentation is simply informational. It does not constitute legal advice, and if you do have a case or a problem, you should consult with an attorney about the specifics of your situation. And just to let you know, the areas of law that I practice are immigration law covering, excuse me? You can't see? Okay. Okay, sorry, we're just gonna fix the lights. Okay, I'll just keep going until they fix this. So I do immigration law from naturalization to removal, asylum, family-based. I also work on employment cases, discrimination cases, security clearance issues. A lot of people within our community, unfortunately, have had problems with security clearances, notwithstanding that people want our language skills in the government. And post 9/11 issues from covering surveillance to religious and racial profiling, and know your rights presentations such as this one. Okay. Can you see? Yeah? Okay. So what I'm going to cover today is I'll do a brief overview of constitutional rights or key amendments within the constitutions and what to do if you're approached by law enforcement agents and your rights at the border, laws prohibiting material support to terrorism and how that ties into giving to charities, particularly Muslim charities, because as you know, there's been a lot of controversy around these issues as well as prosecutions. So the First Amendment gives you the right to free speech, free association, and free assembly. The government cannot regulate the content of your speech unless you are literally inciting violence. So you cannot incite violence and say, let's go kill X. That's not protected by the First Amendment. But you can engage in dissent and you can disagree with the government, you can disagree with your president, you have the right to your own political viewpoints. The government can regulate the time, manner, and place of your speech. That's why you have to get a permit if you want to have a protest, et cetera, and there are certain places you can and cannot do it. The Establishment Clause of the First Amendment just tells you, essentially says that the government cannot favor one religion over the other. So it can't help Christians but not help Muslims. It can't help Jews but not help Hindus. It has to stay neutral. So in other words, it is kind of a hands-off policy. And the Free Exercise Clause allows you to have freedom of religious beliefs. Now, what you can do in furtherance of those beliefs sometimes can be regulated. And that's kind of a much more detailed analysis, but you are allowed to believe what you want in your religion. It's just what can you do about it can sometimes be regulated, such as child labor. You know, someone can say, well, it's my religious belief for my children to work. And let's say it really is a religious belief in some religion. That might not be able to be acted on because of child labor laws. That's just an example. The Fourth Amendment, and this is important when it comes to search warrants and subpoenas and issues that come up with probable cause. So the government cannot engage in unreasonable searches and seizures, and then you get into this whole debate about what is unreasonable and what isn't. But a warrant can't be issued without probable cause that there's a crime. So the government can't just come into your house and just look around and snoop around. They have to have a probable cause that a crime actually existed. And that is a basic right that you have. And if they come to your house and say, I have a search warrant, and they have a warrant, the judge signed it, there's probable cause it's a crime, it doesn't mean you have to talk to them. You can still say, I plead the Fifth Amendment, I don't want to talk to you. They can just go search. And there's usually the search warrant will say, we're looking for this, and they can't just search everything, and there's a criteria in the warrant, and I'll go into more details on that. And just to give you an kind of idea of what a search warrant is. So a search warrant is a court order authorizing law enforcement, usually the police, to search a specific location to seize evidence. So unless there's an exception, and there are some exceptions, which I won't go into here, but generally they have to have a warrant. So if you're ever approached by law enforcement and says, can I search your car, can I search your house, can I search your bag? You say, do you have a search warrant for that? Because they can't just come and harass people. That's a fundamental right. And it has to be specific to the area and the object to be searched for. It has to be signed by a judge. It has to be dated. And you can look at it. You have a right to say, I'd like to see that warrant, please, before they search anything. And just briefly, what probable cause means. Facts must exist to establish that evidence of a crime will probably be found in the area to be searched. It can't be based on a hunch. Cops can't say, well, I think that guy over there looks suspicious. That's profiling. That's improper racial profiling. Okay, somebody's African American, I think that they're a drug dealer. Somebody is a Muslim, I think that they're a terrorist. That's exactly what we cannot allow to happen. It has to be based on facts that the reasonable, a reasonable basis that there's actually a crime. One very common tactic that occurs is they'll tell you, well, if you don't let me search your property, I'm just going to go get a warrant or a subpoena. That's a very common tactic. We say, okay, well then go get one. Because if they really had the basis, they would have already gotten one. They wouldn't have wasted their time asking you for cooperation. And clearly state that you do not consent to a search if they do not have a warrant. Now, if they have a warrant, then they have a right to search the property. And something else to be careful about are consensual searches, and this is where a lot of people do get in trouble, is sometimes somebody will knock on the door and say, can I come in? And you say, oh yeah, sure. And that can be interpreted as consent to search your house, or definitely at least the places where they can see. And you know, often people say, well, I don't have anything to hide. What's wrong with that? I don't want to be adversarial. Well, what happens if one of your friends left something in your house or put something in your backpack, or your kids is... You never know what's there that you didn't even know about, and that could get you in trouble if it's your house. Plus, there's just the right to privacy, and you have the right to say, I don't want you in my house. If somebody knocks on your door, you can step out of the house and say, yes, how can I help you, officer? And you're outside the home, and if they have a warrant, then they'll show it to you, and if they don't, you say, well, thank you very, you can have the conversation, or you can say, I don't want to talk to you at all, I want to get a lawyer, and I'll go into that. But I would just be very careful, because there's tactics that they use in trying to kind of get in and say it was consensual. The other thing is that if you are in a roommate situation, the roommate can consent to common areas, and parents can consent to search of their children's space. If trash is not considered yours. Once you put it outside, it is public. They can go through your trash, and often in investigations they do. And there's also identity theft concerns, so it's usually a good practice to shred things, especially with personally identifiable information. And this is something that a lot of people don't know the difference, is what's the difference between a subpoena and a warrant. So a warrant, I just went through the process of, they have to go to a judge, which is a really important process, because a judge isn't just going to sign anything because they have an interest in preserving the rule of law in the country. A subpoena is really an administrative request that just says, okay, hand me all the documents related to X. And they just go to court and they just apply for it, and then you get it. You can quash it. So they don't have to go to a court, that subpoena. So a subpoena is much weaker than a warrant, and therefore they use it more often. It sounds really scary. It sounds really important. It sounds like you have to do it. No, you can go quash it. Usually you hire a lawyer, and they then go to court and say, what is the basis for the subpoena? Do they have the right to this evidence? And there's a lot of ways that someone can test it. But don't assume just because you got served with a subpoena for documents or for information or property that you have to give it. You do have the right to contest it. And just as an FYI, what often happens is they will go to third parties and issue a subpoena, your email provider, because they want your emails, a telephone provider, they want to know your calls, and that's a little bit trickier from the individual rights perspective because you may not even know it happened, and sometimes they don't want to fight it. Usually companies won't always accept the subpoena because it undermines their credibility, because if their subscribers know that they're just handing over all this information to the government, they may not want to do business with them. But they certainly don't have the same interest that you have in preserving your privacy. And the next constitutional right is the Fifth Amendment. So we all know I have the right, I'm going to plead the Fifth, I'm not going to say anything. The other rights you have, right to a grand jury, double jeopardy, you can't be tried for the same crime twice, self-incrimination, you do not have to testify against yourself, and due process, which is that things are applied equally and fairly. And the Sixth Amendment. Oops, sorry, I think I went a little bit too fast. I don't even know. Okay, I'm going to just go over the sixth without this. Just a speedy trial. You have a right to confront your accuser. So somebody can't just go and accuse you of a crime and you don't get to see them and respond and say, wait a minute, I don't agree, this isn't even true. You have a right to an attorney in a criminal case, the court has to pay for it, or the government, and you have a right to know what the charges are against you. You don't just get hauled into court and you don't even know what you did wrong. That's under the Sixth Amendment. Okay, this is also really important. So factors to be considered by non-citizens, because many people in our communities are not citizens, because many of them are immigrants. So you cannot, everything I just said applies more or less to both citizens and non-citizens, but just wanted to focus on a few things. Non-citizens cannot be criminally punished for speech. So the First Amendment protects everyone, not just citizens, and you can't be prosecuted solely for your speech. However, the government, particularly the immigration services, have very broad authority when it comes to immigration benefits. So now you're out of the criminal realm and into the immigration realm. So sometimes, and it's hard to prove that they did this, but they do have the authority and they do have the discretion, is that they will harass people. And it will be because of their political beliefs or because of their speech. But the reason why they will, for example, deny your naturalization application is because they don't like your politics. They won't tell you that. Or that they will not allow you to adjust status from a student to a green card holder. And that's where they do have a lot of power, which frankly is why it's always a good idea to naturalize if you can naturalize to be a U.S. citizen. You have a lot more protection from that type of, those types of experiences. The other thing is they can remove non-citizens for violations. So sometimes what's happened, and again, this is all very hard to prove, these are just based on trends, is certain people have certain political beliefs or associations, and then suddenly you find out that they are being removed for alleged fraud in a naturalization that happened years ago or in some application. And so what it does is it brings to their attention, and then they dig and find something else. So it's not that they are deporting people because of their speech, it's just that sometimes their activities bring them under the radar screen. And I don't want to say that to say you shouldn't then contest things, you shouldn't dissent, you shouldn't think freely. I just want to make you aware that being a non-citizen certainly has different considerations than being a citizen when it comes to these types of issues. However, as a non-citizen, you still have the right to protection from unreasonable searches and seizures. There still needs to be a warrant, for example, to search anyone's house, whether they're a citizen or not. Although well, this is the caveat, it's always the good news and then the bad news. If they get evidence that couldn't be used in a criminal trial because it was in violation of the Fourth Amendment, they might be able to use it in an immigration proceeding when they're trying to deport someone, because the rules of evidence are not as strict in immigration. And as far as the U.S. border, and I know there's been a lot of complaints about being searched at the U.S. border, being questioned at the border when people are traveling in and out, is the government has a lot of discretion, a lot of authority. That's really where the power of the government is at its peak for both citizens and non-citizens. And that's why they can pretty much do almost anything they want. Not anything, but almost. You still have the right to remain silent, even if you're a non-citizen. You can say, I don't want to talk to you, I want to have a lawyer. If in an immigration proceeding, you do not have a right to a lawyer that's paid by the government. You have to pay for your own lawyer. In a criminal proceeding, the government has to pay for it if you can't afford it. Be very careful about signing anything without reading it, because you never know what the implications are. And two things that are really, really not a good idea to do are showing fake immigration papers or claiming to be a U.S. citizen if you are not. That can be devastating. There are people who've said they were U.S. citizens, and then when it was time for them to apply and they otherwise would have qualified, will be barred. The government does not like people saying they're citizens when they're not. And same thing with fake immigration papers. The other thing is lying to a federal agent is a crime. And I mean, just lying. Not under oath, not in a courtroom, just lying. FBI agent comes up to you, a federal agent, not local state, but comes up to you and asks you a question and you lie. They can prosecute you for that, and I'll go into more detail. And that's why these voluntary interviews are very risky and fraught with peril, and many of us as civil rights advocates really strongly recommend that people get lawyers if they are approached for a voluntary interview. Okay, and I don't know how familiar you all are with the voluntary interview issue. I know that there had been a lot of Somali youth, both female and male, as well as adults and people within the other ethnic backgrounds within the Muslim community that have been approached for voluntary interviews. So there is no warrant, there is no criminal charge. It just says, well, will you just talk to us? We just have a few questions for you. The first thing you have to keep in mind is it is an adversarial process. Adversary versus adversary. The job of the FBI is to investigate, and ultimately prosecute crime, including terrorism-related crimes, for example. Their primary interest is not to preserve your civil rights. Now, they do prosecute hate crimes, and they do a pretty good job at that, but those are actually two different divisions often, and it's different agents. And so, you know, this whole like, I'm your friend, I'm on your side, I really wouldn't buy that, because a lot of people, unfortunately, have lost their liberty because of that and been either removed or detained. There's a lot of public pressure on law enforcement to show they are tough on terrorism and to be tough on crime. It's kind of like the war on drugs in the 80s and the 90s. And that's led to very aggressive tactics against people within our communities. I mean, there's been complaints of agent provocateurs, there's been complaints of informants, there's been a lot of public complaints about the outcome of that. So these are something that, you know, I hope none of you have had to deal with, but I think it's wise to at least know what your rights are if you or somebody you know is approached by an FBI agent or someone in the Joint Terrorism Task Forces, which I can get to in a minute. But generally, if you get the agent's business card or name, number, telephone, contact, say, thank you very much, I'll be in contact with you, and you got a lawyer. And then the lawyer can advise you what is in your best interest. Sometimes it's in your best interest to actually go ahead with the voluntary interview with the lawyer present, sometimes it's not. It all depends on the circumstances. But generally, you have a right to refuse to be interviewed, you have a right to have a lawyer present, you have a right to set the time and place of where the voluntary interview is. Most lawyers will tell you not to interview in the government's office because it's going to be recorded. And you're going to be in their territory, so it's easier for them to harass and intimidate you. So sometimes people will have it at their lawyer's office or at a third place that's neutral. They ask about a variety of subjects, and this is all based on people who have been interviewed and complaints have been filed with advocacy organizations, travel history, immigration status. They've asked about religious practices, which many of us in the legal community think is completely inappropriate. You know, you have a right to pray, you have a right to go to a mosque, and they shouldn't be asking you about that. Your political beliefs. So that's why it's wise to have a lawyer, because lawyers will usually stop that line of questioning, say, excuse me, but whether someone prays or not has nothing to do with criminal activity. Nothing to do with it. And they're just inappropriate questions. They sometimes ask for a lie detector test. You'd never have to take a lie detector test. It's not required. And they're very inaccurate, oftentimes come out negative. False positives are very common, and usually people will do it if they're in a bind where they have something on them and they use it as a settlement or a tool with their lawyer taking the lead on the negotiations. Also be very careful of volunteering information that's not asked, even if it sounds very innocuous and very benign, because it can end up getting other people asked for voluntary interviews too. Oh, well, I saw so-and-so here, and I did this, and I did this, and I did this, and even if they didn't ask you about it, then they'll just write all those names down, and they'll go talk to them, and then they'll go talk to them, because oftentimes it's really a fishing expedition. They don't really know what they're looking for, they kind of know, and people's rights are at stake. And again, going back to the adversarial process, at the end of the day, their job is to prosecute, investigate crime. And if you think you got caught in the dragnet and you end up being deported, or you end up losing immigration benefits, or even in jail, that's not really their problem, because you're not their client, so to speak. They don't represent you individually. And sometimes, even if they can't find a criminal act or a terrorism-related act, they will find something else, and that you may not have known about, or you overlooked, or you wanted to fix, or could have been resolved in another way. Sometimes they ask people, so don't assume if somebody comes, if you get approached by an agent that you did something wrong. Like I said, sometimes it's just they're fishing, and they're trying to figure out, they want to lead, like for example, after the attempted Times Square bombing, there were a lot of reports, particularly by the Pakistani American community, because of the individual who, he was originally from Pakistan, he had come here, and a lot of people were being questioned that had nothing to do with it. But it was, again, they were trying to figure things out. And the problem with that is if you don't do it in such a way that your rights are being preserved, you could get caught into something that has nothing to do with that issue, but maybe something that is unrelated, immigration related, for example. Oftentimes they'll say, oh, you're not in any trouble, we just have some questions. And a lot of different types of people have been interviewed based on the anecdotal evidence that we have in the advocacy community. Citizens, permanent residents, people affiliated with certain mosques, etc. I don't think it necessarily means, it does not mean that you've done anything wrong, again. It's just that they're trying to enforce the law, but in I think, sometimes not in a very direct and competent way. Okay. Lying to a federal agent is a crime. This is where a lot of people get in trouble that have nothing to do with terrorism, haven't even, immigration-wise, they're fine, they're clean, but they say something, they lied. No, I didn't travel to Sweden last year, and they did, but they were scared because they were asked and they were intimidated and they just felt, they just said no, but they did travel. And it's something very minor. It was completely legal, let's say, to travel to Sweden. But they lied. And the government, if they want to, they don't have to, they say, okay, well, we're going to charge you with a crime of material false statement, and you can face up to 5 years in jail, and if it's terrorism related, it could be up to 8 years in jail. And there have been people who have, that is exactly what's happened to them. And one can speculate why they do that. Maybe they already thought the guy did something, or the woman did something bad, but they couldn't prove it, or they just didn't like the person. But they have a lot of discretion and a lot of power. And so that, again, going back to, you have to think about what's in your best interest in protecting your rights. And just because they're done with the interview and they say thank you very much, goodbye, doesn't mean they closed your file. Sometimes files stay open for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. You don't know. And sometimes they come back. And some people have complained of being coerced into being informants. And that has been a problem. There was a very public case in Florida, I don't know if you heard about it, but there was an imam who is Iranian descent, and the FBI tried to push him and coerce him into being an informant, and he said, I think what he said, this is all in the media, is he said, well, I will go tell my congregation that the FBI has asked me to tell them if I see anything suspicious. And he said, I'm going to tell you anyway if I see someone doing something illegal or about to, of course, because it will harm all of us. But I have to tell them, because it would be a breach of my trust if I didn't tell them. And they said, no, that's not what an informant is. He said, well, then I guess I can't be what you want me to be. And then they said, well, we're going to make it impossible. They tried to deport him, and now the case is in court. So it was essentially a coerced informant situation. And that's, again, the risk. And sometimes what they do is once they get people to cooperate in these voluntary interviews, even if they have nothing on them, they'll say, oh, well, what? They try to get them to be informants. And there's a lot of different tactics. I mean, one can only speculate what they're doing. Okay, just going back to your right to remain silent again. There are a few exceptions. You do have to at least identify yourself and say, I am so-and-so, and show a driver's license if you've been stopped, for example, in a car. If you're an immigrant, you do have to show proof of immigration status. And just to let you know that they're pretty well trained. They're trained to be persuasive, and they have certain tactics. So they might try to make people feel scared or guilty or impolite for refusing to provide information. They'll be like, well, why do you want to talk to us? Do you have anything to hide? You don't have anything to hide. Oh, no, I don't have anything to hide. And then they start talking, and then something else happens that is completely unexpected. They might try to minimize the significance of the question. Oh, this is no big deal. We just have a few questions, and then we'll leave you alone. That's happened to some people, and they got asked again and again, and they kept being asked for more and more voluntary interviews, and maybe by the third time, they made one false statement, and then they decided they wanted to prosecute. Okay. And this is the 18 U.S.C. Section 1001. That's the law, that's the statute that makes it a crime to make a false statement to a federal official. And the false statement does not have to be related to terrorism or crime. If you look at it, it just says, knowingly and willfully falsifies, conceals, or covers up by any trick, scheme, or device a material fact, makes any material false, fictitious, or fraudulent statement or representation. So number 2 is a key one. And 3, makes or uses any false writing or document, knowing the same to contain any material false information. So if there's anything you remember, just remember that. And then the usual, get a lawyer. I mean, I'm an attorney, so I believe in what my profession does and the value it adds, but these types of things, the stakes are too high, whether it's yourself or your parents or your friends or anyone that experiences these unfortunate circumstances. And they can advise you on how to proceed. And sometimes the lawyers will say, this person should speak to them. It really depends on what's going on. Why are they wanting to speak to this person? Do they have something problematic? But they can at least also set the guidelines. Okay, a few things about the border. A lot of people, and I know many people travel and go back and visit family from various places in the world. And there have been a lot of complaints by Muslims, Arabs, South Asians, Sikhs about being searched at the border. If you're a U.S. citizen, you have the absolute right to enter the United States. Have you guys heard about this no-fly list problem? So what's happened recently, and it's actually quite phenomenal, it's essentially imposed exile for U.S. citizens, is that after the December 25th attempted bombing by the Nigerian man, they obviously, there was a lot of controversy, and what seems to have happened, I don't know for sure, is that they boosted the no-fly list. They just doubled or tripled it, and people who had traveled abroad and were not on the no-fly list got on it, whether rightfully or wrongfully, nobody knows, because there's a lot of misidentification that's been going on. You know, there's a lot of Ahmads and Muhammads in our culture, and sometimes they don't know the difference between this Ahmad and that Ahmad. And then they try to come home and they can't because they're on the no-fly list. And if you can't fly these days, you usually can't come to the border. And some people even try to go to Mexico, and the Mexicans will take them back, will push them out. Because if that U.S. citizen gets to the border, they have to let that person in. Now, they may put them in jail, but at least then you can go to a court, you can go to a judge and say, Judge, what's going on? Why am I on the no-fly list? Have I done something wrong? Going back to your right to face your accuser, going right to knowing what the charges are against you. But again, if you can't get to the border, that's kind of a useless right. As far as non-citizens, if you're a visa holder, you do have to answer questions because they can deny you admission. You know, if you just have, let's say, a student visa, your non-immigrant visa, visitor visa, they can say, no, thank you, go back to your country, you can't come in. Green card holders, again, you're not a citizen, so you don't have an absolute right to enter. They could deem you at least removable and not let you in the country. It's a little bit more complicated with them, but I just wanted to kind of go over the general idea. They have a lot of power at the border. They can search anything without suspicion, including U.S. citizens' property. They can't do invasive searches without reasonable suspicion. So they can't do body cavity searches, strip searches. Those are extremely invasive. They have to have some strong, you have to have a reasonable suspicion. The cavity search issue usually comes up when they think somebody swallowed drugs and that they have drugs in their body, a lot of the drug carriers. But they have to have a reasonable suspicion that that's actually happening. The bags and belongings searches, they can screen them even if There's nothing suspicious. Now, the problem that's arisen, and again, it's very difficult to prove, is that, for example, Muslims or South Asians or Somalis or Arabs will say, well, I think you stopped me because I was an Arab, because I was a Muslim. So it's not that you can't search my stuff, because you can, but you stopped me instead of this person because of my religion or because of my race or my ethnicity, which is a violation, potentially a violation of your equal protection rights of discrimination. And it's difficult to prove. So that's kind of what's come down and hasn't really gone anywhere thus far. It's also very difficult to litigate. As far as the religious head covering, you have an absolute right to wear your headscarf. Now, they can search it, and there's different methods, and this has been a big issue, especially with the Sikh community. The Sikh community has done a very good job of leading this, because many of their men wear turbans, and they don't want to take them off, and it's very complicated, actually, for them to put them on, too. So they have a system where sometimes they'll do a wand, and then they'll do a pat down, and then you can tell them, I don't want to take it off, do the wand. Or I don't want you to pat down, I'll do the pat down. So you can pat your hair, or your scarf, for example, or put your scarf under without having to show it, and then they search your hand with the chemical residue, and they put that little cloth to make sure there's nothing there. Or at the last resort, as you can see, if they're really pushing hard, say, okay, I want to go into a private area and have a woman, and I'll take my scarf off in front of the woman, and she can see that it's just my hair that's under the scarf. There's nothing unlawful. But you do not have to take that headscarf off in front of everybody and violate your religious rights. There are accommodations that can be made where security can still be preserved and your religious rights. Now, what if you do think you've been discriminated at the border? There's some relief. It's not foolproof, and there's been a lot of complaints about these avenues of redress, but there's no harm in trying. First, you should get the officer's card and speak with his or her supervisor, because sometimes people have sent some really rude, offensive, and racist statements. There have been complaints of just officers saying things that are racial slurs or anti-Islamic, Islamophobic statements, things about Islam or the Quran, things that are really, really inappropriate and they should be fired for. But if you don't complain about it, if you don't document it, they're just going to keep doing it. And it's not necessarily the government's policy to do that. It's usually a person who's behaving outside of the policy, and they're not supposed to be doing that. You file a complaint with the Transportation Security Administration. They have a website. There's a lot of civil rights advocacy groups, which I'll give you the list of at the end. The Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties has a complaint process on their website, because the Customs and Border Patrol, these are the agents at the border, they're under the Department of Homeland Security. So they're under their jurisdiction. Now, those complaint processes are slow. They're not transparent. There's a lot of complaints against them. But you should still use them. At least it creates a record. And if you do ultimately get a lawyer, those can all be part of the record. And they don't have to be your only avenue for redress. Okay, I think I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to have to go very quickly. This is just, so as you know, there were some incidents, I guess it was about 2 years ago now, where there were some youth, Somali youth, that were from Minneapolis that were accused of going back to Somalia and joining Al-Shabaab. Okay, this is where you get into the material support to terrorism laws. Al-Shabaab is designated as a terrorist organization by the US government. No one can give material support to any organization that's been designated by the US government, even if it has nothing to do with the US, has nothing to do with US soldiers, US people, anything, because some people will say, well, people wanted to go do something abroad. They didn't want to kill Americans. They didn't want to hurt Americans. They didn't want to do anything to do with America. It was the Civil War or somewhere else. If you cannot give material support to an organization that is designated as terrorist. So in this example, I'm giving this hypothetical. Let's say it's Al-Shabaab. And there are lists that are available at the State Department website and the Treasury. It is a little bit complicated. They're really lengthy. There's a lot of acronyms, but you technically can check because there's individuals there too. And I don't know if you guys have been keeping up, this was a recent Supreme Court decision, and it was very problematic from a human rights advocacy perspective, the Humanitarian Law Project, where there were some organizations it was actually a judge, a former federal judge, American, who wanted to go and teach the Tamil Tigers and the Kurdish Stand Party how to use the United Nations system to solve their grievances. In other words, put down your guns and pick up your pens and go through an adjudicatory system. Don't use violence. That was what he wanted to train them. But they were designated as terrorists. So he went to court and asked a judge and said, can I do this? I don't want to help them engage in violence. I want to persuade them to go the opposite way. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that either. So, and I could have a whole presentation about the legal analysis there. But so the law is not very favorable right now. And all you have to know, you have to have knowledge that the organization is. Now, I just want to move to the Muslim charities really quick so that you know if you're donors, it is legal to give to, I mean, you can give to a charity that is not designated as a terrorist organization. It's registered as tax exempt by the IRS. And there are things you can do as a donor to protect yourself. Make it clear. So on a check, say, money for poor orphans, money to feed the poor, money to help pregnant women get medical assistance, money, whatever it is that you're giving the money for. It protects you to write that intent on the check so that if anybody ever questions, they say, look, my intent was this very legal, charitable cause. It was not anything illegal. There have been very few, if any, actually, I don't know any situations where donors have been prosecuted for material support. Now, you know charities have been shut down. You know about the Holy Land Foundation, Benevolence International, Global Relief. This was in 2001, 2002, where a lot of Muslim charities were shut down after September 11th, and the government claimed that they were supporting terrorism by giving money abroad to certain organizations. But the donors weren't prosecuted. It was the organization and their officers. The problem is some of the donors, the big donors, felt like they were being harassed because they gave donations. So their immigration records were looked at, and other kind of collateral issues. But generally speaking, you can go and you can give money to a Muslim charity or a non-Muslim charity. And you know, just do your due diligence. Look at their papers, see what they're about, what do they do. I mean, you want it not just for the criminal reasons, but just so that your money is going to the right place and that they're not keeping it or embezzling it or doing something else. And there is if you want to go online, there's a great report by the ACLU about the Muslim charity issue. It's very comprehensive and really informative. It's called Blocking Faith, Freezing Charity. It was published in 2009, and that's the URL, but you can Google it. Blocking Faith, Freezing Charity. And just be careful with wire transfers. You know, you have to do your due diligence. It's, you know, so you know that your money's going the right place, because it would be dishonest, I think, of many of us who do this type of work to say that it's not going to be scrutinized. It doesn't mean it's illegal, but you just need to make sure that you're, you know, giving it to the place that you intend it to give it to. Okay. And then finally, oh, I missed that one, but I just wanted to emphasize getting involved. Know your rights, which is, you're starting already. Get involved with community groups, which you're here doing, that's fantastic. Participate in the political process. If you're a citizen, register to vote, if you're, you know, over 18. Vote in local, state, and federal elections. Naturalize to be a U.S. citizen if you qualify. And be an active member of American society. All of these things are going to help empower, you know, yourselves and your community and the issues that you care about. And then these are just some of the organizations that you can contact if you are concerned about something or you just want to learn about certain issues. They have a lot of informative reports. But, you know, Bill of Rights Defense Committee, Center for Constitutional Rights, American ACLU, CARE, Muslim Advocates. Many of you have probably heard of them. And that's it. I apologize for it being lengthy, but as you can see, there's a lot of issues that need to be discussed. There is one thing I do want to just end with quickly, is I hope that a certain percentage of you in this room are going to be attorneys in the near future, because we really need more attorneys from our community. And I think that I'm very excited at the next generation. So if you all ever have any questions about the path to that, and I actually have a mentoring program that I do in the DC area that helps non-lawyers go through the law school process and become lawyers, and I'm very fortunate to have a lot of lawyers willing to help. So I do hope that rather than boring you to death today, that I persuaded you to perhaps think about the law as a professional path. Okay, does anybody have any questions? Thank you very much.